Because since we're talking about capitalism, maybe I can say a few words about Marxist political economy. Is that okay? It was always assumed that people get paid for the work that they do, right? And we say this to this very day. You know, if I make $10 an hour, say I get paid $10 for every hour I work. But as a matter of fact, as Marx pointed out, workers don't really get paid for the work that they do. They get paid for their capacity to work, for their ability to work. That is to say, they get paid what it costs to keep themselves alive in order to go to work.
We began this episode with a clip from a 2009 talk by philosopher Angela Davis, currently Distinguished Professor Emerita at the University of California, Santa Cruz, talking with her audience about why Marx is so relevant to thinking about the modern world. So today's special guest is Andrew Hartman, Distinguished Professor of History at Illinois State University, where he teaches courses in U.S. history, as well as courses in the philosophy of history, historiography, and pedagogy. Hartman, who has been one of the guiding figures of the new American intellectual history, has focused his work on the meaning of culture in the United States and where the battles over what counts as American culture have occurred since World War II. Culture wars are, in a way, a proxy for political struggles over major social institutions, schools, families, churches, as well as what United States citizenship means and requires. Inevitably, Hartman was drawn to a European intellectual who reappears as an inspiration if you are a progressive or radical thinker, a danger if you are a liberal, or a curse if you are a conservative. That's Karl Marx, much of whose work was not available in the United States in his lifetime, but whose thinking reverberates to each new generation and helps us think about what it means to be free. Andrew and I sat down to talk about his new book, 10 Years in the Making, Karl Marx in America, and how this visionary traveled across space and time to help Americans think about who we want to be. Andrew Hartman, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Claire. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, Andrew, your new book, Karl Marx in America, I'm going to hold it up for my audience. It's so beautiful. It's been in the works for, 8 or 9 years, right?
Yeah, it took me about 9 years to research and write. It took me a long time, and it grew to be a much larger book, a much bigger project than I originally anticipated.
So where did you start, and how did you end up with a comprehensive intellectual history of Karl Marx in America?
Well, when I was putting the finishing touches on my last book, A History of the Culture Wars, I was kind of looking around for another project, and I had just read Jennifer Ratner Rosenhagen's wonderful book, American Nietzsche. I really liked the concept of reception history, of kind of tracing how Americans have thought about this European, this very sort of seemingly foreign thinker, and how they've tried to make sense of their worlds through the eyes of Nietzsche, or at least through his thought. I thought that was a great concept for a book, and I thought, well, surely somebody has done this with Marx. And that's the book I wanted to read. And I did a little digging and nobody had done that. And I thought, well, maybe I'm the right person to do that, since I'm a trained intellectual historian and have spent the better part of my adult life really sort of obsessed with Marx. So that's where I started. It was about 2015-16 when I just started reading a lot and trying to conceptualize the project.
So did you actually begin by reading all of Marx?
Well, I started reading Marx in the early 90s when I was a young man in my early 20s. And then throughout graduate school, I belonged to a Marxist reading group. And so I had read a lot of Marx, probably all of the most important works, well before I undertook this project. And I did reread a lot of it during the research for this book, but rather what I what I did, because I was already so familiar with kind of the larger body of Marx's works. What I rather did was, as I was researching how Americans have put Marx to work, how Americans have conceptualized Marx to make sense of their worlds, if they turn to a particular text or particular aspect of Marx, that's what I really dove into and reread and tried to relearn anew.
And as I was reading the book, and I first thought, okay, this is going to be a great book because I love everything that Andrew writes. But as I was reading it, I realized what a touchstone Marx was in my own life, that as a very young intellectual in high school, it was cool to read Marx. People would walk around with large modern library editions of Das Kapital and so on, and it marked you as cool, it marked you as serious, it marked you as being kind of counterculture, but better than that. And then my first year in college, the Yale Facebook, then, it was an actual book, and if you failed to send in your picture, they used a picture of Karl Marx instead. And that was like a huge joke on Yale. But one of the things I did my first semester in college was take a seminar in Marx, because at Yale you could sign up actually for any seminar you could get into. And I remember both thinking that it was easier to read than I had thought it would be, and spoke so much to that moment, which was the late 1970s. Why does Marx keep speaking to us, even as our history changes, and his doesn't, because he's dead?
Yeah, that's the question that animated the whole book project, because it seems that every generation returns to Marx for the first time and finds something extremely relevant. The big picture, or I guess like the sort of generic answer to that question, is that he was the world's most famous critic of capitalism, and the United States historically is the nation in world history most committed to capitalism. So like piecing these two, Marx and U.S. history together, or the American experience together, to me has always made sense, and it's clearly made sense to a lot of people. Also, though, Marx wrote so much of which, of course, was not published during his lifetime, only was published during the 20th century, and wrote so much about so many different types of things that just seem to continue to speak to us as modern human beings. Whether it's about capitalism and the labor theory of value, whether it's about imperialism or what he called primitive accumulation, whether it's about alienation, the young Marx's writings about estrangement. There's just so much there, and it seems as if like the world continues to be to melt, all that is solid is melting around us. And so Marx just continues to speak to the modern experience, especially the modern experience refracted through capitalism.
Yes, and one imagines he will speak to us again as jobs disappear through AI and the economy transforms again. But one of the points you make in the book is that people are often speaking about Marx when they don't know they're speaking about Marx, that he has become so much the wallpaper of our critiques of modernity as it evolves that often people don't even know that they are drawing on Marx. How did that happen, Andrew?
Well, yeah, I mean, you could even say that the word we use to describe our political and economic system, that is capitalism, probably wouldn't exist without Marx. Even though it's a word that he rarely used, he used the word capital to describe the sort of object rather than the system. But because so many people in the late 19th century who were looking around and to some degree rejecting or resisting this system that was emerging during the Industrial Revolution turned to Marx, and especially by the 20th century when you had the Bolshevik Revolution and then the many other communist revolutions that followed in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution, Marx became the touchstone, the thinker who was critical of capitalism, who was the person we would turn to for thinking about a different world. And I just almost became one of these thinkers that is more like the air we breathe. His ideas, the words he used to describe things, just became a part of the common discourse in ways that are quite ironic.
Yeah, so let's bookmark some of this for our listening audience. Tell us, what is Marx's trajectory? When is he born? When does he start to write? When does his work start to become popular? When does he die? Let's just get that down for listeners.
Little biography, yes.
Yeah.
He was born in 18 in the region of Prussia, not yet Germany, of Trier, and his father was a lawyer. His father was Jewish, but had, prior to Marx's birth, converted to Protestantism because in order to be a practicing lawyer, you could not be a Jew. But he basically grew up in a pretty educated, kind of middle-class, atheist setting, and his father had high expectations of him to also become something useful like a lawyer. Went off to college in Berlin, did a lot of partying, a lot of bar fighting, discovered that what he really loved at that point was poetry and then philosophy, and then of course a woman by the name of Jenny who had kind of like an aristocratic background. And so his life was going in directions that his father was not pleased with. He ends up taking a PhD in philosophy, but what he really wanted to do was become a journalist, and so he moves back to the area of Trier and edits a journal, and this is all happening in the time when there's a lot of just sort of political instability, a lot of people from liberals to more radicals like Marx, they would have referred to as communists, who were rejecting the Prussian regime, which was quite autocratic. And so the journal writing gets him into some trouble. We're talking about like the late 1830s, early 1840s. And he ends up spending most of the rest of his life in exile. But he marries Jenny. They move to Paris. While in Paris in 1844, he writes these brilliant long manuscripts, which become known as alternatively the 1844 manuscripts or the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, never published during his lifetime, but some of the most really sort of brilliant existentialist poetic writings of Marx. Prussian police chase him out of Paris. He ends up for some time in Brussels. Prussian police chase him out of there as well, but this is right about the time when the 1848 revolutions break out all over Europe.
Yay!
Yeah, right? And so although they were crushed, so not a happy ending there. But he and then by this time his good friend Frederick Engels, it's 1848, they're highly involved in what's known as the Communist League. They write the Communist Manifesto in 1848. He's still not a well-known figure. Like, nobody in the United States knows who he is. Nobody in England by this point really knows who he is. Small radical circles might know who he is. But he and Engels go back to Prussia during the 1848 revolutions, and Engels is actually on the front lines fighting, leading troops against the Prussian forces, while Marx returns to editing a journal, gets in quite some trouble. When the liberals turn against the radicals, they turn against Marx, and Marx is put on trial. Luckily, he thought he was going to be executed, but luckily he just ends up being sent into exile again, this time permanent, and he spends the rest of his life in London. So from 1849 or 1850 until his death in 1883, he's living in London. For much of that time period, living in quite a bit of poverty, especially early on in the 1850s. In fact, he and his wife Jenny, they have 6 children. 3 of them die in the 1850s at a very early age of tuberculosis, or the types of sicknesses that poor urban people's children died of in that time period. And, he continues to write. In the 1850s, Marx and his family survives by getting supplemental income from Engels, who by this point is running his father's factory in Manchester. But he also survives by getting a paying job writing for the New York World Tribune. This is the newspaper that all good Republicans in the United States are reading during the 1850s and beyond. The publisher is Horace Greeley. His editor is Charles Dana, who discovers him in Europe. Charles Dana's looking for kind of like an interesting radical writer as a European correspondent. And so Marx writes over 500 articles for the New York World Tribune during the 1850s. And the Tribune during the 1850s is probably the most read, most subscribed to newspaper in the world. So he gains this huge readership, even though they don't publish bylines. And so he's writing for a huge American audience of Republicans, including undoubtedly Abraham Lincoln. So they learn about Europe and they learn about the world through reading Marx, but not knowing his name. By the time the Civil War breaks out, the Tribune fires him because they have to cut back on costs due to the war. But he continues to pay a great deal of attention to the United States. He keeps up a regular correspondence with Engels about the Civil War, and also with several of his comrades, the German 48ers who had emigrated to the Civil War, many of whom, like Joseph Wedemeyer, who were fighting in the Civil War, became Union leaders, officers during the Civil War. And he writes these amazing articles during the Civil War. The Civil War made him optimistic for the first time politically since the 1848 revolutions failed. He saw it as like a sign of a coming global working class revolution. He hated slavery on moral grounds, but he also believed that the working class could never gain power. There would never be like socialist solidarity so long as part of the working class was enslaved. And he writes about this quite eloquently in several letters, but also in Capital, Volume 1. Capital is published in 1867. He starts to finally become more famous. He's heavily involved in the First International, which also makes him famous. In fact, the Paris Commune of 1871, even though the International had nothing to do with it, Marx gets blamed for it. This is like the first of many instances of Marx getting blamed for something that he had nothing to do with, oftentimes things that happened well after his death in 1883.
Oh, and he's also now blamed by Donald Trump for everything, too. So
this continues, yes.
It continues. And it's one of I know all of us write books not knowing what's going to happen when they land, but it struck me as a particularly fortuitous moment given the use of Marx and Marxism as a kind of curse on X by the right against anybody who's left of center, that this is a moment for readers to really dig in and find out who Marx was, what he's meant to the United States, but also, just to highlight something you're saying here, that events in the United States drove Marx's thinking. And so there is a kind of intellectual exchange between the United States and the European philosophers who are variously socialist or following Marx, and they're kind of riffing off each other by the late 19th century, right?
That's exactly right. Obviously there's been a lot of great scholarship on this transatlantic exchange, but most of it has focused more on like progressives, pragmatists, and social democrats. But the degree to which Marx was both shaped by paying attention to the United States and so many people, intellectuals, scholars, activists, politicians who were shaped by Marx's thought in the late 19th century. Less is known about that, and I try to really highlight that in the first couple of chapters of my book.
Right. And I want to get us into the 20th century, but just also to pause for a second, that the influence of Marx on a variety of 20th century social movements. You and I were talking earlier about my biography of Susan Brown Miller, and toward the end of her life, I interviewed her every week for this book I'm writing. And at one point, I said to her, how did you light upon rape as the thing you had to write about? And she told me a whole story about consciousness raising. And then she looked at me, and this is this very old lady, and she says, Claire, the best ideas come from the masses. And I thought, here's another little thread between Marx and radical feminism. Some of them came out of the old left and communism as a movement in the United States, but they studied Marx. And they brought those ideas to radical feminism as they thought about gender as a class in and of itself.
Yeah, that was one of the more fun things to research and write about, especially as we move into the 20th century. And that is all the various groups in the United States who we wouldn't necessarily classify as Marxists, but whose thoughts and paradigms were shaped by their engagement with Marxism. I kind of call these hybrid Marxists. So anywhere from feminists, of course, and I go into detail with some, especially someone like Angela Davis, who I just find amazingly fascinating and one of the most brilliant Marxists of the 20th century, but also thinkers, a variety of black thinkers, ranging from someone like A. Philip Randolph in the early 20th century on through to someone like Cornel West or Cedric Robinson in the late 20th century, a range of indigenous thinkers. I undertake a pretty extensive analysis of Leslie Marmon Silko's amazing novel, The Almanac of the Dead, which is a 1991 novel, which she admits is kind of like her homage to Marx. Just the sort of like the Christians who embraced Marx and sort of morphed Marx to fit their world, pragmatists like Sidney Hook. The list goes on, and what is it? The question is, what is it about Marx that makes his thought so amenable to so many different sort of political and intellectual traditions in the U.S. and elsewhere?
Right. Well, and of course, let's not forget W.E.B. Du Bois, who you write about. And Du Bois's shift to Marxism is really sort of his defining intellectual moment in the 20th century. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So I undertake a pretty close reading and extensive analysis of his, what I think is his masterpiece book, Black Reconstruction in America. It's published in 1935. And it's published in the midst of just like incredible intellectual and political turmoil ferment for him. From like about 1931 until that book comes out in 1935, he undertook a very like serious reading of Marx. He's teaching Marx a seminar on Marx in Atlanta, I think at Clark at the time. He is Marx and the sort of world around him involving the Great Depression and the labor movement and all that's happening has made him rethink a whole bunch of categories. And out of this comes what I think is one of the most brilliant books of U.S. history ever written. And Black Reconstruction is a weird Marxist book because it's trying to do a whole bunch of things that people who are sort of like orthodox or dogmatic Marxists then and now might think, well, that's not Marxism, is interested in something else. But what I find is like all of these people, including someone like Du Bois, especially someone like Du Bois reading Marx, is they open up different avenues for thinking about Marx and the whole Marxist project. And he certainly did that by understanding the Civil War as what he called a general strike, basically a class revolt on par, as he puts it, with the Russian Revolution, and understanding the enslaved who revolted against their masters, the Confederates, during the war as like a class revolt, and then a sort of like deep, really interesting analysis of Reconstruction as a class struggle that ultimately gets defeated. Just super fascinating, and I think it sort of lays the groundwork. It was largely forgotten for several decades for political and social reasons, but really lays the groundwork with a revolution in historiography that takes place in the 60s and 70s, and you kind of see come to fruition in Eric Foner's big book on Reconstruction.
Right. And of course, there's that wonderful introduction that he writes in which he takes down the Dunning School in the most absolute and devastating possible terms. But to sort of roll back to the debate as to how Marxist Black Reconstruction really is, I would sort of turn that on its head, because I think one of the things I see in the book is that Marx's texts have, I would say, an almost unique capacity, and there are a couple other thinkers we could throw in there, like Freud, to, even when people are in disagreement, they can create something else that is coherent because he built the house in the first place.
I think that's exactly right. If you think about like what are some of the sort of basic principles that Marx laid down for us from which to work, what people later called historical materialism, that is that the sort of the matter of history, the social foundation, the economics of history is really going to be one of the most important driving forces of historical development, historical progress, historical reaction. That Black Reconstruction is a Marxist text because that is the framework that Du Bois works from.
Right, right. So let's talk about the latter part of the book, in which Marx as a figure, as a text, kind of gets sidelined by post-war reaction to the left, and specifically anti-communism. How does Marx as an intellectual figure survive that?
So that was like the darkest moment for Marx in American history, and that is probably the years between 1945 and the early 1960s. This is, of course, the most intense period of the Cold War, McCarthyism, the Red Scare, etc. And I kind of contextualize my history by looking at that larger political and social history. But I'm mostly interested in how did the various intellectuals who became so prominent in American political culture during this time period, how did they deal with Marx? One of my most surprising findings is anybody who was anybody in this period, this early Cold War period, had a take on Marx, had an opinion, had something about Marx worked out. They felt it was necessary. And that's because prior to that, in the 1930s, Marx was so important. Many of the people who were critiquing or denouncing Marx in the 50s had been Marxists in the 30s.
Yeah.
And so, liberals undertook a serious reading of Marx, a quite interesting one, I think, in the post-war period, in order to prove him wrong and to prove America, or to prove what they invented as the liberal tradition in this time period right. Conservatives did something similar, except their mission was not to prove Marx wrong. For them, that was a foregone conclusion. Rather, what they were interested in is demonstrating that Marxism was a very, very close cousin, maybe a kissing cousin of liberalism, because liberalism to them in this time period was the great enemy. Conservatives were on the outside looking in, and they wanted to destroy liberalism or overtake liberalism for American power. And by associating liberalism with Marxism, that was kind of the mission. Out of that came some really interesting texts as well, really interesting arguments that sort of formed how many conservatives still think about Marxism and liberalism.
Right, and some liberals. I mean, if you look at Arthur Schlesinger's The Vital Center, that's really about how do we take what we want and need from left-wing thinking and make it into something that's truly American.
Yeah.
So, I'm thinking of one of the other great readers of Marx, which was J. Edgar Hoover. And before he becomes the director of the FBI, he is working for J. Mitchell Palmer, and he spends his nights reading Marx because he wants to know what all those communists and socialists and revolutionaries are really thinking about. So it's a text that sort of travels around to unlikely locations. What is the most unlikely place that you found Marx in America?
Wow, that's a tough question. I mean, J. Edgar Hoover's a good place to start. When you have presidents like Kennedy or Eisenhower quoting Marx, not that they necessarily read Marx, but one of their speechwriters read Marx or at least had a pull quote. That's a kind of interesting thing, when you have Ronald Reagan making the case that communists are communists because they read Marx, but Americans or conservatives are conservative because they understand Marx. It's kind of interesting and surprising. I always found it fascinating that you had these kind of someone like Jack London wrote about this. He would be marching east with the bonus army, and he'd be at some campsite with a bunch of unemployed vagabonds, and they'd be sitting around the campfire with some ragged copy of the Communist Manifesto. It seems like something from an Upton Sinclair novel. It doesn't seem like it could be the case, but I found there's a lot of evidence of that, especially in the kind of early 20th century. Might not be surprising, but to me, to find actual evidence that this was the thing happening is, it's kind of interesting and almost gives me hope too.
Yeah. Well, and of course, one of the places that is perhaps most likely, and you talked about your history with Marx, is the university. And Marx undergoes this great revival in the 60s and beyond in American universities, to the extent that when critics refer to many universities as nests of Marxists, well, they're not entirely wrong, are they?
Not totally wrong. It's definitely overstated. But so in the 1960s, what I do is I track what I call these Marx boom periods in American history, when lots of Americans are reading Marx favorably. And that, of course, Marx, the 1960s is kind of what I consider the third Marx boom period. And you have all of these new left activists. Many of them are red diaper babies. They probably got Marx in their cribs from their parents, but many of them are discovering Marx for the first time, and they're discovering him on college campuses. He's being assigned by some of these emigre professors, Frankfurt School professors, or some of the kind of younger professors who were turning to Marx and kind of turning to a critique of the American Cold War, or they're discovering them for themselves, and they're kind of creating their own reading groups and journals. And Marx becomes fashionable in the 1960s as an explanation for alienation. They discover the young Marx. He becomes fashionable as somebody who's a critic of imperialism, obviously with the Vietnam War on everyone's minds. And so many of the new left people and new left sensibilities kind of remained on college campuses. And Marx goes on in the 70s and 80s and beyond to shape history departments, sociology departments, cultural studies departments, English departments, kind of the list goes on in terms of humanities and social sciences. And in a time period of reaction, the Reagan era, Marx stays alive on college campuses. And in fact, by the year 2000, the Communist Manifesto is either the second or third most assigned text on college campuses by a sort of accumulation of syllabi. And that's interesting. It's kind of remarkable.
Yeah.
And so, Marx wasn't really informing people politically necessarily. There wasn't really a movement that was grasping onto Marx during this time period. But lots of people are still reading Marx and thinking about Marx and making sense of their worlds through Marx.
Well, he produced a series of texts and a way of thinking that brings people together to make new things. I mean, you mentioned cultural studies there. Cultural studies, of course, comes out of the Frankfurt School, really. But a lot of the people that I knew in the early years of cultural studies were very serious Marxists. I'm thinking of Richard Oman, who wrote that terrific book about the professional middle class and how it was created out of magazine reading, that people learned how to be middle class by reading magazines, and that ideas about class formation as new kinds of class formation shape the nation, they're all springing off of the dynamics that Marx first described in Middle Europe.
I think that's precisely true. And then there's these amazing cultural studies scholars like Frederick Jameson who are using a Marxist lens to kind of like understand the way in which, and this is also a Frankfurt School lens, a way in which culture kind of both keeps people trapped in a system, almost like a cage, an emphasis on the cage, but also that culture becomes a sort of place of resistance, a place of labor. And if you're a Marxist, if it's a place of labor, it's a potential site of resistance. That becomes really paramount in the 80s and 90s as well.
Right. And also to Foucault. I think what you're saying, which is just something I want to emphasize for the audience, is that Marx is spoken about by his critics as somebody who wants us all to be imprisoned by the state, basically. And Marx's theory of the state was not that. Marx actually saw the state as the pressure point that would lead us to revolution. And of course, we're in that moment right now. Why should people be reading Marx right now, Andrew?
Yeah. So I think the big political takeaway from my research, and hopefully many readers will get from the book, is that Marx was a theorist of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
The sort of the stereotype born in the 20th century, especially the Cold War, of Marx as being like a totalitarian thinker who gave birth to the Soviet Union and the horrors of the purges, etc., that doesn't track with his texts. He was just interested in how do people have autonomy. And whereas that, freedom and liberty have long been obsessions in American political thought, most American political thinkers didn't focus on the labor side of things. They were focused on the state, and they were focused on other aspects of civil society, perhaps, that might infringe upon our freedoms. But they weren't focused on the thing that in a capitalist society we all have to do, and that is go to work. And are we free at work? Are we free when we have to sell our labor in order to survive? It's kind of like the basic premise of Das Kapital. To me, that's a philosopher of freedom that still speaks to our world quite a bit. And as our freedoms are infringed upon in all sorts of ways, I think it's important to turn to all types of philosophers of freedom, and Marx would be the top of my list.
And it explains why there are so many young people, so many queer people, so many trans people sitting around Brooklyn reading Marx, because they indeed are trapped in some of the same ways. And Marx holds out the possibility that solidarity can get us to some other place. You know, I was thinking about this book a lot over the weekend as the events in Minneapolis began to escalate again, resulting in the death of a 37-year-old ICU nurse, the murder of an ICU nurse. And they interviewed all of these white people who are coming in from the suburbs to Minneapolis and just saying, you know, I never thought I was this person, but it turns out that when it gets this bad, I am this person. And I kept thinking, you know, Marx knew that. He knew that there was a certain political moment that would get people out of their houses and into the streets working as one.
Yeah, I think we should take hope from that. So a lot of the Marxists of the early post-war period focused on the emergence of fascism, especially the Nazis, in part because many of them were Jews from Central Europe, like the Frankfurt School intellectuals, and they were quite pessimistic about, I guess, the prospects of working-class solidarity precisely because of those horrible experiences. And so even though things are really bad in the US and elsewhere right now, I think the lesson should be hope in that lots and lots of people are actually resisting. Lots of people, as they're saying, are not licking the boots of the fascists. And that's something that, you know, inspired Marx and hopefully would inspire us as well.
And that's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow us on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe for free by searching for us on your favorite podcast platform. If you do, please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Our podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers. Political Junkie is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is Pont Marie by Rêve Français. You can find their work and all the talented artists we feature on these episodes on Soundstripe. That's all for now. See you next week.